After the publication of the Sue Gray report into Downing Street parties, Boris Johnson said this to Keir Starmer in the House of Commons.
He spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile, as far as I can make out, Mr. Speaker.
That was a smear. While Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions when it chose not to prosecute the case, he had no direct relationship, no direct involvement in that decision. And when the decision was made, Starmer had only been DPP for a year. So it's difficult to say, well, this was the culture he created. All that means that Boris Johnson is not making a genuine point there. He is tapping into a right-wing meme that somehow Starmer let Savile off, and he didn't. Evidence of the tenuousness of Johnson's attack was that his cabinet colleague Dominic Raab refused to repeat it the following day.
I'm certainly not repeating it. I don't have the facts.
Well, why don't you repeat it if the Prime Minister believes it? Why wouldn't you repeat it?
Look, I'm not repeating it. One thing I would say, though, Nick...
No.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister of this country...
I don't have the facts to justify that.
Well, does he have the facts?
But that's for him to be... But all I'm
saying is... Does any minister have evidence of what the Prime Minister said under the protection of parliamentary privilege?
I haven't done a trawl of ministers to check that. What I'm saying to you is that I can't...
Well, we can get him in if you like. You are his deputy. Okay. Who else do you want me to ask?
So, well, Nick, you can ask me, and I'm saying I can't substantiate that.
Tory MPs even tweeted calling Boris Johnson out for the smear. Julian Smith is a former chief whip. He wrote, "The smear made against Keir Starmer relating to Jimmy Savile yesterday is wrong and cannot be defended. It should be withdrawn. False and baseless personal slurs are dangerous, corrode trust, and can't just be accepted as part of the cut and thrust of parliamentary debate." In terms of the impact of all this, there are two theories about how this will affect Starmer and Johnson. One is that by saying what was clearly a smear in Parliament, Boris Johnson only furthers the impression that he's a cynical liar. The other theory is that it really doesn't matter whether journalists and politicians debunk Johnson's claim. On the day after a report into government rule-breaking, there was a public debate about Keir Starmer and a prolific paedophile. And for Boris Johnson, of course, that's a good thing. Personally, I think the jury's out on what the consequence of all this will be. It could go either way. What's clear already, though, is that Keir Starmer is playing to different rules than his predecessor. When Starmer was smeared by the Prime Minister, Tory backbenchers defended him. When Corbyn was smeared, his own backbenchers would join in. This double standard doesn't just concern MPs. Britain's well-paid centrist prophets have suddenly also come to the realisation that smears are bad. LBC host James O'Brien tweeted, "The Savile lie is the most Trumpish yet. I think every sentient Tory MP knows he's lying, but they can't call it out without calling Johnson a liar, and they can't do that without unhitching themselves from him. The ones who find the courage to do the right thing should be thanked." It is, of course, fantastic that James O'Brien is now calling out politically motivated smears, but it's notable how these comments from the author of books including How to Be Right and How Not to Be Wrong contrast with what he had to say for the 4 years Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the opposition. In 2016, he tweeted, "Do you think Putin could get Corbyn into Downing Street?" In brackets, "Vladimir, if you're reading this, it's a theoretical question, not a challenge." In 2018, he tweeted, "You're perfectly entitled to be untroubled by the fact that a KKK leader thinks he's on the same team as Corbyn regarding, quote, Jewish establishment power. But telling other people that they're not allowed to find it deeply disturbing is a bit, well, fascistic." So, in 2018, calling out smears was fascistic. But in 2021, when you happen to like the leader of the opposition, anyone who doesn't call out smears should be ashamed. Finally, in the misinformation stakes, this is right up there from 2019. Putin's got Farage and Seamus Milne doing his bidding. A ridiculous conspiracy theory repeated by James O'Brien in the year when it mattered, when Jeremy Corbyn was still Labour leader and there was a general election coming up. Of course, more significant than what James O'Brien said on his Twitter feed was what he said on his LBC show. That was to 1.3 million weekly listeners. But it would take, of course, a whole show to go through the bullshit he spouted there. We're not going to do that. I don't have time because I have one more centrist prophet to show you. Otto English is the pen name of writer and journalist Andrew Scott. He came to fame writing anti-Brexit diatribes in Politico and the Byline Times. After Johnson's Savile smear, he tweeted, I have no beef with those on the left who dislike Starmer. Personal choice and all. But if you are continuing to deliberately spread disinformation about him and Savile, despite all the evidence proving that the story is nonsense, well, you're no better than Johnson. Now, I personally saw barely anyone on the left buy into the Starmer-Savile smear, but we can see why Otto English might be particularly sensitive to these things. He is, after all, a specialist in fake news. He recently published this, Fake History, 10 Great Lies and How They Shaped the World. And the advert for the book promises it will reveal, quote, the facts behind the fiction. Unfortunately, Otto wasn't so fastidious with the facts when it came to a politician he didn't happen to like. When the smear that Corbyn laid a reef to terrorists was promoted by the right-wing press, Otto attacked those standing up to them, tweeting, thinking of laying a reef to Owen Jones' career if this all goes on much longer. He then shared this. It's a thread supposedly proving Corbyn was present at the graves of, quote, Black September terrorists. Sharing this, English tweeted, amazing thread on Jeremy Corbyn and that reef. When called out about the inaccuracies in that thread, English admitted it contained errors, and in response to my colleague Aaron, he said, reading about it now, with all the information available, and you are quite right, he was totally stitched up. Of course, being willing to correct errors is a good quality, but after 4 years, it's a little late. As context, if you're lucky enough to have forgotten the ordeal, the reef story was a central smear levelled at Jeremy Corbyn. The Daily Mail claimed Corbyn had laid a reef to anti-Semitic terrorists in Tunisia. He had, in fact, attended a memorial for members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization killed in an illegal Israeli airstrike. The smear was based on misinformation, but it was effective because, one, Labour MPs and Liberal journalists repeated it, and two, it preyed on the electorate's basest assumptions. Corbyn was supportive of liberation movements in the global south. Therefore, he sympathised with terrorists. Therefore, he was an extremist. Therefore, he hated Britain. Those broader terrorist and extremist smears were ones Liberals like Otto English were more than happy to support when it mattered. In 2019, he tweeted, I condemn absolutely anyone who unequivocally supports terrorist organisations. That's one reason why I don't vote Labour anymore. I think Corbyn's unrequited support for terrorist groups is utterly beneath contempt. Just 1 year earlier, he had declared, the truth is that on Russia and Syria and Brexit, next to nothing divides Nick Griffin and Jeremy Corbyn. Might be unpopular to point this out, but there you go. Now, I've given you two examples there, Otto English and James O'Brien. Not necessarily people who should occupy too much of your time when you're sort of analysing politics and working out what's going on. But I do think this is incredibly significant because while I don't like to obsess about the past 5 years because, one, it's incredibly frustrating, and also I think it's better to look into the future. I do think the role that the liberal media and actually more than anyone, centrist Labour MPs played in furthering the smears against Jeremy Corbyn and, anything that was thrown at him by the Conservatives or by the right-wing press, they repeated. And for me, that's why it's stuck. Because with Keir Starmer, as I say, I don't know which way this is going to go. It could be the case that now people associate him with Jimmy Savile and some of them don't vote for him. I doubt many people who take that seriously would have voted for him anyway. What happened with Jeremy Corbyn was quite different because it wasn't just people saying, oh, right-wingers think Jeremy Corbyn is a terrorist sympathiser. Right-wingers think Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite. I don't really respect them anyway, so I don't believe them. I think that's what will probably happen with Keir Starmer in this story because it's only Boris Johnson and some of the most, well, in this case, the most obviously right-wing papers that are saying it. So if you are inclined to vote Labour, you'll say, well, they're only saying that because it's Boris Johnson. He's the opposition. They're only saying that because these are the right-wing papers and they would hate Labour anyway. Why people found it believable with Jeremy Corbyn was because they said, well, these smears which begun in the Daily Mail, they're now being repeated by the Liberal guy I listened to on LBC. They're now being repeated by Labour backbenchers. If all of these people who in my vision of politics, where you have the left and the right, if all these people on Corbyn's side thinks he's dodgy, thinks he's a terrorist sympathiser, thinks he's an anti-Semite, then maybe it is true. And that's why, to my mind, when it comes to the downfall of Corbyn and the hit job, essentially, the British establishment managed to play on him, it is people like the James O'Briens, the people like the Otto English, the people like the Labour backbench MPs, who probably have more responsibility than anyone else. Because the people who, if you've said your whole life, my ambition is to destroy the possibility of socialism in this country, if you've said your whole life, look, I hate the left and I hate the Labour Party, then when you successfully manage to undermine the prospects of Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader, I disagree with you, but, fair play. That's your side. That's what you've always stated that you wanted to do. You've always said you want to destroy the left and the possibility of a progressive government in Britain, and you did it. When it comes to Labour backbenchers, when it comes to these liberal pundits, they are people who will now say, oh, Boris Johnson, how did we end up with this Prime Minister? And we ended up with this Prime Minister because when the Murdoch press made stuff up about the Labour leader, when there were Conservative attack ads against the Labour leader, which were completely based in fiction, and by the way, appealing to the basest, most racist, xenophobic, cruel assumptions of parts of the British electorate, you didn't say, wait a minute, maybe they're smearing this guy. Maybe we shouldn't trust Britain's oligarchs, right-wing press and Conservatives when it comes to judging a guy. Maybe we should look a bit deeper into these claims instead of mindlessly repeating them. But no, they mindlessly repeated them. They mindlessly repeated those smears. They took the Times, they took the Daily Mail at face value, all of these people who were supposed to have critical thinking, and now we have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister.